Well, we finally did it. 100 movies you must see before you die. 100 reviews spanning 1,337 minutes and 19 seconds, or 22.2 hours to be precise. Totally didn't need to work that out. And we're gonna rank every single one of the fuckers and decide if they should be in the book or should be replaced by a much more deserving film. Honestly, the only real reason that this one is the lowest is because although others may be more infuriating, I can't help but sit here and wonder, what the fuck is this? What was the point of it? What does it mean? Who was it made for? Why does it exist? And if a movie is so worthless and so incompetent that you start to wonder why it was even made, you are doing something wrong. So why not completely get rid of it? I don't care how experimental it was, let's remove it from the book and replace it with Manos, the Hands of Fate. Yeah, it's bad, beyond bad, but I do believe that sometimes a film can be so infamously awful that it should be seen to be believed, especially due to the colossal impact it left on cinema, for better or worse. There's not a lot to say about this one. You could often argue that my short attention span is the reason I'm not a big fan of certain films, but can we all agree that 7 hours is just sadistic? I can literally drive to Scotland and have lunch and the film will still be playing. I can fly to Italy, have a game of 18-hole golf, stop for dinner and fly back before the movie ends. It's shot nicely, but that's about it, so I don't feel bad removing this pretentious crap and replacing it instead with Charlie Kaufman and Spike Jonze's adaptation. No real connection between the two films, I just really like it. A genius meta-style film that was once in the 1001 and some crockpot decided, nah, let's take it out but keep in Satan Tango. I'm not gonna lie, this was pretty close to being at the bottom as well. The acting is some of the worst I have ever seen, and I am amazed at the success of it. It's not like it's charming for the bad acting either, but it portrays women as all psychopaths, and you know what, I'm just gonna move on. So let's take out this overacted horrible mess and replace it with another overacted horrible mess. Yeah, I have no shame. Face Off may have over-the-top acting and a really cheesy premise, but it completely embraces it. And for a film that's so off-the-walls insane, it has some of the most mind-blowing and revolutionary action scenes of all time and some of the most quotable lines of dialogue to come out of the 90s. How the hell was John Wayne successful after this? He has the talent of a plank of wood. The cinematography and some of the supporting performances are decent enough, but it's the ending that solidifies this pile of crap as one of the worst I have ever had to sit through. I'm glad that other people got something out of this, but personally, I just don't see what makes it must see. So why not take it out and replace it with the infinitely more deserving Superman the movie? Why isn't this in the damn book already? There's already a fair few superhero movies in here, and I firmly believe that if not for this one, they wouldn't even exist. It's revolutionary, not just as a superhero origin story, but also comic book movies in general. I don't know who I need to speak to get this put in the damn book. Look, I get why it's in here. It boosted the found footage genre into the stratosphere, but my god, I cannot emphasize enough how much that is a bad thing. The acting is atrocious and almost every single scare is ripped from other better movies, recycling cliches found in every ghost film known to man and adding nothing to the genre except for an endless string of sequels and copycats. So why not take it out and replace it with the movie that actually did start the found footage genre? Cannibal Holocaust. Not only did this practically create the found footage style that's been so drilled into the ground these days, but it's one of the most controversial movies of all time. Sure, there were pieces of shit because animals are straight up slaughtered on camera, but the director was actually taken to court because so many believe that some of the actors were actually murdered during filming. That to me makes it more than worthy to be in this book. Now this is going to surprise you all, but I do think this belongs in the book. It really does. As boring as it is, as bad as the acting gets, as unlikable as some of the characters are, the movie does have something genuinely unique to it. In the review, I compared it to TV shows or long-running franchises which show people growing up on screen, but this was the first time it had actually been achieved in a single film. Now don't get me wrong, the movie sucks! But the unique premise of filming one over 12 years is completely original and should be respected. I hate being nice about things I don't like. I'm sure back in the 40s this was seen as scary, but now it just looks so cheap, and the weird performances and unintentionally hilarious moments don't really help matters either. So why not replace it with the much more obvious choice, the 1991 version. This was the first Disney film to be nominated for Best Picture. It has so many charming characters, memorable songs, an intimidating villain, a heartfelt romance between a prisoner and her captor. I didn't just say that. It's my favourite Disney movie of all time, and I demand to know why it isn't in this damn book. Put it in or I will riot. Not necessarily horrendous, but I just don't think it's for everyone, which is a major problem. Unless you're heavily into ballet, I can't see anyone else being into the film, which is a real issue when you're trying to cater your movie to a wider audience. Which is why I'm gonna remove it and replace it with 8 Mile, and not just because my husband's in it. Just hear me out. Not only did this lead to the first ever rapper winning an Academy Award for one of the most iconic hip-hop songs ever written, but it revolutionized how hip-hop was portrayed in film. Every biopic regarding a rapper after this tried to be 8 Mile. It blew up the battle rap scene, and every white battler thereafter tried to be Eminem even more than they already had been before. It introduced battle rap to a much wider audience while telling a compelling semi-biographical story of Slim Shady's life. It's not perfect, the acting needs work and some of the script is a bit sloppy in places, but you can't deny the impact that it made. I'd just like to remind everyone that this won Best Picture over The Dark Knight. That is all. In all seriousness, some of the acting is okay and the host is hilarious, but it's also illogical, boring, contrived, mean-spirited, depicts India completely inaccurately and negatively, and is just a slog of dog shit. So let's swap it out for Shrek. Shrek was almost like the Scream for animated films, before it became the very thing that it was making fun of. Hey, it really is Scream. Shrek was revolutionary and one of the most quotable animated films of all time, with some incredibly cleverly written humour, especially for a kids movie. Certainly more deserving than the shite it's replacing. There's nothing really to say about this one, it's just dull. Sure, Fonda and Sutherland turn in good performances, but it's by far one of the most unengaging and lifeless mystery movies I have witnessed. So why not replace it with a much better mystery movie? Dark City. I often feel like this one gets lost in the shadows, but it is well worth the watch. A great atmospheric piece with incredibly underrated performances and insane visuals that predate similar films like Inception or The Matrix. It's just a very impressive movie. Well, we're not silent anymore, so I can finally voice my dislike of this pile of cow shit. It may have been revolutionary for its time as it invented a lot of editing and camera techniques that have become basic practice in filmmaking, and for that I guess it deserves to be in here, but that still doesn't make it any good in my eyes. It's horrifically racist, has no identifiable characters to speak of, and worst of all, it's just boring. Maybe worth a try as a piece of filmmaking history, but that's as much credit as I'm willing to give it. Now we're on to films that aren't necessarily terrible, but just don't belong in the book in my opinion. The Wolfman is alright, but honestly I have no idea why it's in here. I won't compare it to later werewolf films because that's not really fair, but I can compare it to the likes of Dracula or Frankenstein at the time, and there's no comparison. This is just there. So I'm gonna take it out and replace it with my good old buddy Oliver. This damn film won Best Picture, and I'll be damned if it's not accepted as the greatest musical of all time. The songs are iconic, the performance is memorable, and it's one of the most impactful films ever made, and it deserves to be recognized as such. Another one where, I mean, it's not a bad movie, just a bit boring and not really my thing, but what in this screams must see? Am I missing something? It's just a big nothing to me, so instead I'm gonna remove it and replace it with Good Will Hunting. This is another that was once in the book and removed because the Lord hates me. I get it if others aren't a fan, I do, I understand. It can be slow paced at times, but it gave us one of the most iconic performances in movie history and one of the most heartbreaking scenes ever put to film. It has Robin Williams' genius improvisation, Matt Damon tugging at your heartstrings, and it's a brilliantly human piece, portraying childhood trauma in such a relatable way it deserves to be acknowledged. This one isn't necessarily bad, it's just, I'm still at a loss as to what the hell the message was. Are guns bad or not? It gives off conflicting messages, and Michael Moore comes across as a massive dickhead half the time with the comedic talent of a toothbrush. But that being said, I will commend him for having the balls to make something like this at the time and for asking people the difficult questions. So yeah, I do think it belongs. It naturally sparked controversy, and although he got historical facts wrong and completely used Marilyn Manson and twisted his words and manipulated victims of a high school tragedy for his own self-worth, it was alright. I really don't get the hype for this one. I mean, it's fine, I guess. Brando's performance is incredible, as is some of the dialogue, but that's about all it has to offer in my eyes. It did admittedly have a lot of influence in that many future actors took inspiration from Brando's style of acting, so in that sense it does deserve to be in here, but it just wasn't for me. It's an acquired taste for sure. Another one that just kind of exists. It's fine, but a movie you must see before you die? Let's just swiftly remove this Johnny Depp picture and replace it with another one. Pirates of the Caribbean: Curse of the Black Pearl. I'm not as crazy about the first one as everyone else. I enjoy the original 3, but this one isn't my favourite. However, you can't deny the impact and legacy of the Captain Jack Sparrow character that Johnny brought to the role, with so many memorable and quotable lines, all based on a damn theme park ride. Not really a Western kind of guy, but I'm not crazy. This movie certainly set standards for the genre in the years to come. The filmmaking is certainly impressive, as are the performances, and it does deserve to remain in here. I mean, if this was the 1001 weirdest movies to see before you have an aneurysm, this one would definitely be in there, but as is, it's well made, but my god, you're constantly wondering what the fuck you're watching. So let's just remove it from the book and replace it with another movie that gives off the same reaction. The Room! Yeah, I don't care. Much like Manos, this film is so bad, so staggeringly incompetent, so spectacular in its oddness, you truly have to experience it to believe it. And it's become so iconic in the last 20 years, it needs to be put in and secure its place in cinema history. Often forgotten for its 1980s counterpart, this version most certainly inspired gangster films in the decades that followed. Of course, it's nowhere near on par as the Pacino film, but it's still iconic for its day and left a huge impact. What an average film this was. It has since been removed from the book, probably because of how painfully mediocre it is. I think some could argue that it was in here because it set the standards for legacy sequels in the years that followed. It was one of the first times we saw the same cast members coming back to the franchise that made them famous decades later. But much like Paranormal Activity, is that really such a good thing? Yeah, thanks Force Awakens, because of you we got Hocus Pocus 2. Nah, I'm gonna take this out and swap it with a much more deserving Star Wars movie. Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Anakin's transition into Darth Vader is way too rushed and some of the dialogue is still pants, but the emotion and action is some of the best in the entire saga, and it really pushed the boundaries with how dark these movies could get. What a strange little film this is, but that doesn't mean it's bad. It's fine, and it's quite creepy with a great atmosphere to it. And you know what? I'd say it does belong. It has a unique feeling to the film, and it is very, very creative. So yeah, I'd say it's worth checking out. The reason Nanook of the North deserves to remain in this book is because not only was it very new and creative for the 1920s, just documenting an Eskimo, but the fact that it blended reality and fiction so well in a decade where that was unheard of. It's an incredibly ballsy move. Another long one here, but at least it's not 7 fucking hours. Charlton Heston gives one of the most legendary performances, and the harsh depiction of brutality on screen is incredibly difficult to watch at points due to the sheer realism. The chariot scene alone deserves to be in the book, but I can't do that, so have the whole film instead. Much better, nice and short. I honestly really got a kick out of this one. A very creative idea that wasn't done before, and it aided in cinema's experimental style, and it managed to do all of it in less than half an hour. So stay it shall. I like this one a lot, but it's another one where I don't quite get why it's a must-see. It's interesting to combine a runner with a real historical event, and I love the performances and characters, but a must-see? Really? Let's just shove it to one side in favour of Shaun of the Dead. Not necessarily a parody film just because of the title, but a truly hilarious comedy that so many films tried to imitate for years. It showcased Edgar Wright's talent, the duo of Pegg and Frost, but I also think what makes it great is that it blends comedy and horror really well. It has some genuinely intense moments between them making stupid jokes. It's incredible. Never really thought much of Casey Affleck as an actor, but boy did this film change my mind. A heartbreaking tale that really hits you hard. The story itself is devastating and it's carried by an insane lead performance, so you bet your ass I'm keeping it!
Don't you be betting on my ass!
Not as crazy about this film as much as others are, but it is a really good movie. The cast is completely star-studded and Nicholson is having the time of his life. It made a name out of numerous people involved, and yeah, I can't justify taking it out. Continuing with Nicholson now for this intense dark crime drama, and it's another that has to stay in. It's fucked up but very strong and powerful. Difficult to watch at points, but a truly impactful piece of cinema. Very uncomfortable to watch this now, considering the circumstances. And weirdly, I found out that it was recently removed from the book, but I honestly can't understand why. Yeah, the lead is a perverted rapist, but other than that, the film is very strong and memorable with some very clever metaphorical moments on screen. It's a really well made picture. A movie I had never heard of, but I am so glad I found it. It deserves to be in the book. It's so unique and has a lot of strong and dark visuals that stick with you. It's an underrated gem. I can see people's issues with this one. I can understand some being bored and the lead character is really irritating, and am I sure I like this movie? I'm a sucker for the less you see films, and this revolutionized it. It's an intense and scary horror movie where you don't see a damn thing, and it's still terrifying, especially for its time. It deserves to be here. A pretty good film with an interesting lead and a great mother-daughter relationship that makes you think long after it's over. It really showed what women can do as filmmakers in a predominantly male-led industry. So for that alone, I'd say keep this movie in, and well done, ladies! One of the truly hardest films to sit through on this list, and not because it's bad, because it really isn't. It's a great film, but the visuals and what the film depicts is so depressing, so naturally it belongs here. Recommended, but bring the tissues and watch at your own risk. Nicholson is having a field day right now, isn't he? You can't argue with the impact that Terms of Endearment left with truly memorable performances, so of course it stays. In fact, to save us all time, every movie after this remains in the book. The General is insane for its time. Some of the stuff Keaton was willing to do for his craft really shows his incredible passion and talent. This film has a lot of heart. Around this time, it was common for movies to feature living people trying to reach the afterlife, but it wasn't too common to do it the other way round, as this predates the likes of Beetlejuice and The Crow, which both should also be in here now that I think about it. I'll be honest, it took me a couple of tries to watch this because I was so focused and fixated on the one-shot style that I wasn't really paying attention to the plot. Once you do, it only adds to the style. It's not just a gimmick, and it's done flawlessly, where you're frantically trying to find the damn cut. Keaton is the best he's ever been, as are the supporting cast, and even the ending leaves you with a lot to think about. A powerful film indeed. Much more superior to its predecessor, and definitely the most iconic with some of the most memorable scenes and lines in history. And let's face it, when someone mentions the Scarface character, it's Al Pacino you think of, isn't it? Not, whoever the other guy was. This movie was made by someone with serious issues, but hey, the best films are. I'm a sucker for one location films, so when I saw the opening, I expected that, but then it takes a detour and there's so many twists and turns to keep you guessing, and kind of vomiting. This is a movie that I think has actually aged better over time, unfortunately due in part to Robin's passing. Knowing what we know now, it makes this character and performance even more lovable and heartbreaking to see him ignore his own needs just to make others laugh. Sometimes they do exaggerate his humour for the most mundane jokes, which Americans tend to do an awful lot, but it's still a fun film with great humour and great drama. One of the most iconic fantasy films ever made. How could I not love it? Wallace Shawn is beyond annoying, but other than that, it's got great performances, great lines, and it just has a really charming feel to it. And it has one of the greatest wrestlers of all time in it, so there's that. I don't think anyone's too surprised I rank this higher than a lot of others. It's Dad Jokes the movie. It's basically a bunch of brothers doing a feature-length stand-up routine, and I love it. The jokes are cleverly written, and it's just a lot of fun. For 1933, this is beyond impressive. The things they had to do, the issues they had to overcome to make it possible is mind-blowing and incredibly inspirational. Yeah, it looks like shit now, but this was 90 years ago, and it still looks better than anything in Indiana Jones 5! I mean, Spacey is back playing another creep. He really did method act, didn't he? A great crime thriller that keeps you guessing, predating the likes of Saw, but not focusing on the gore and flashy effects. It's just a creepy story. I have some slight issues with the ending, but it's still one of the most iconic final acts in movie history. the film that turned me into a colossal Tom Cruise fan. Not that I didn't enjoy his work previously, I just never saw anything that screamed out to me before, but this performance as a traumatized guy with a douchebag parent and a troubled upbringing who hides it with humor and misogyny, I'm beginning to wonder why I'm related to this character. And it culminates in one of my favourite scenes in film history as he vents to his dying father. It's spectacular acting at its finest. Oh, and the rest of the movie is really good too. I'm a miserable bastard who nitpicks the twist, but honestly the rest of the film is so good I don't care. Haley Joel gives one of the best child performances in history, and M. Night really creates a spooky atmosphere. Creepy visuals, unforgettable lines, and a truly scary story. I spoke about how 8 Mile introduced battle rap to the world. Well, this one really showed us white people what it's like in the hood. A full black cast showing their troubles, and it's an eye-opening classic, featuring Cuba Gooding Jr. in his forever ongoing drinking of the Fountain of Youth. Gene Wilder gives one of the most charming performances of all time as Willy Wonka. It's just a wonderful film, with children being abducted and murdered in a giant factory. But there's songs! Yep, the supposed greatest film of all time doesn't even crack the top 50. Get your pitchforks ready! Obviously, the movie is great and revolutionised filmmaking techniques that are still used today, but it's just not one I find myself rewatching too often. It's brilliant for sure and deserving of its place in cinema history, but I can't really see myself sitting down to rewatch it over tea and biscuits on a Sunday afternoon. Do I even need to explain this one? It's goddamn Star Wars, of course it should be in here. It's the start of the most popular and enduring movie franchise of all time. It revolutionised sci-fi films in general, as well as what could be done with special effects. I hate being this nice about George Lucas. That being said, the reason it isn't higher is because I feel like a lot of the trademark George Lucas isms, like the sloppy dialogue and cringy performances, shine through the most on this one. But the sequels would improve on this. Into the top 50 now, and of course this belongs. Are you high? It's a classic tale that everyone and their dog has watched numerous times. It's a charming adventure and a must-see. Not much else to say, except it's not as good as the sequel. Definitely my favourite silent film. It has creepy ass atmosphere and the makeup for the titular villain is insane. For its time, despite its plagiarism, it has some revolutionary direction. A great classic horror film. A classic with iconic lines and one of the most famous lead performances in history. Honestly, you'd be hard pressed to find anyone who doesn't like Forrest Gump. Just get Jenny out of here, the lying two-faced cheating skunk! Independence Day is so much fun, but I do get it if it's not your thing. The characters are all walking cliches, but the action is so entertaining and the one line is so quotable that I feel like it makes up for it. You get Will Smith hitting things when it's actually allowed, and he's just as badass as ever. Jeff Goldblum is Jeff Goldbluming all over the place. Just get rid of Randy Quaid and it would be perfect. In my mind, the most relatable Stephen King story. Unless, like me, your granddad showed you a mystical ancient cemetery that can resurrect the dead, but it's a great film that many others can relate to, with awesome visuals and a truly sympathetic heroine you can root for. One of the greatest comic book adaptations ever made. Sure, they changed certain things, but if you actually have sex, you don't care. They improved them. Keaton is the best Batman, Nicholson is the third best Joker. The set design and cinematography perfectly captures the tone and style of the comics, and it's overall a blast to watch. Good thing they never made a sequel, and no siree, just the one. A really progressive story for its time, and especially daring too. Gregory Peck's performance is out of this world, but the child actors are also really fantastic. It's an emotional piece that makes it easy to root for the hero and clearly set the standards for later films with similar themes. Hey, remember when Jesse Eisenberg could act? He gives a terrific performance as Zuckerberg and perfectly plays the condescending douchebag. Timberlake and Garfield are also excellent in it. The dialogue is so tightly scripted and well paced. And surprisingly, a semi-true story about creating a social media platform was actually really interesting. Who'd have thought it? A masterful story of suspense. Japanese horror is extremely chilling and this is no exception. Change your underwear because you will shit yourself watching this. A tiny little film you may have heard of. Marlon Brando is absolutely iconic, but the star-studded cast and Coppola's phenomenal direction are just as worthy of praise. It's slow paced, but it's always worth the wait. But it's not as good as... A lot more action in this one, to the point that you're on the edge of your seat by the third act. But the performances are what sells it, especially Ray Liotta and Joe Pesci, with one of the most quotable lines of all time. One of the most heartfelt and emotional pieces of Japanese cinema. A sometimes questionable but overall great lead performance. The third act dips a bit, but it's definitely worthy of being this high on the list. A Christmas classic. Certainly a must-see every year with a tremendous lead performance and a story guaranteed to tug at your heartstrings. And speaking of Christmas, we're on to another masterpiece. Despite some iffy bits in the script that could have been tweaked and Alan Rickman's questionable fake American accent, it's still an absolute classic with spectacular set pieces that launched Bruce Willis's career into stardom and set the standards for future action movies in the decades to come. A classic comedy with a douchebag turning good storyline, but it also strangely has a really clever and unique charm behind it. It's a classic comedy with a douchebag turning good storyline, but it also strangely, yeah, you get the joke. A fun-filled adventure of children going on a journey to investigate murder. But it's a very mature story for the cast and the performances are fantastic, especially for how young some of them are. And pretty much all of them went on to become huge stars. How often does that happen? Although it hasn't aged very well with some dark 80s humour, it's still a lot of fun and delivers a great bonding experience with a bunch of polar opposite characters. This movie is hilarious, and it's a great introduction for those who have never experienced a film by the Coen brothers. It's a casual movie about a couple stealing a baby as they can't have their own. It's brilliant. Except for John Goodman, but you can't win them all. Okay, I was wrong about this film originally. Sue me! I still stand by that the sodding whip is still a ridiculous weapon, and there are some plot holes I feel are left unaddressed, but I'd be a fool to call this anything other than revolutionary. The characters are super likeable, Ford's charisma is off the charts, and the practical effects and stunts are mind-blowing. It's not my personal favourite of the series, but it's hard to deny the impact this had on future adventure movies. Thank God they only did 3 of them. One of the greatest musicals of all time. The choreography is insane and the story well structured, and it only took Gene Kelly to mentally and physically torture everyone behind the scenes to achieve it. What a progressive film to come out in 1992. Trans acceptance doesn't seem like such a controversial idea nowadays, unless you're J.K. Rowling or Ben Shapiro, but back then it was a huge deal, and it's handled surprisingly well. A film with twists that come right the hell out of nowhere, but has a lot of heart and a decent message. The final act gets a bit generic, but it's still a great watch, and Forest Whitaker breaks the record for the worst British accent in the history of cinema. Although it's not as good as Black Christmas and it spawned a shitload of poor imitators, Halloween is still a classic. The iconic Laurie played by Jamie Lee Curtis, the debut of the legendary Michael Myers, and Donald Pleasance chewing every frame he's on camera for. What more can you ask for? This film made me cry like a baby. A relatable, heartbreaking story about a father and son, and every single actor sells the drama and tragedy of the situation perfectly. It really opened a lot of eyes with how it discussed the theme of absent mothers, and it certainly left an impression. Alice in Wonderland is complete dog shit, but Spirited Away is that kind of thing, but not dog shit, so it's great in my book. Gorgeous animation, and don't let the fact that I reviewed the Hungarian dubbed version for some reason fool you. The sound design is incredible and the music flawless. It's a masterpiece. The only MCU film to make it in the book, and it didn't disappoint. Again, it's not my personal favourite of the franchise, but it's definitely one of the most impactful in terms of what it did for black representation in blockbuster films. The late Chadwick Boseman is tremendous, but the supporting cast are also fantastic, and the villain is one of Marvel's best. Wakanda forever, indeed. I can't really say that this one is an enjoyable movie. It's very disturbing, but that was what they set out to be. It's truly one of the most warped films ever made, with intense imagery, especially for the 70s. Certain aspects are still a bit dated and haven't aged particularly well, but for the most part, it's a classic horror that is guaranteed to leave an impression on you. Speaking of disturbing, how about an underage girl playing a hooker? And I've put it in the top 25. A great film with a perfect lead performance. The action is insane with tremendous direction from Scorsese, with a really cool end scene that keeps you thinking. A film that was quite daring to portray autism on the big screen, causing a lot of controversy among audiences. A tremendous performance from both men on a great journey with a transitional shift from Tom Cruise. This is such a unique idea. The fact that it was so convincing a mockumentary that people thought they were a real band. In addition to some genuinely great music, and when it comes to comedy, they always crank it up to 11. I bet some of you are annoyed that this isn't the highest Star Wars film on the list. Easily one of the best sci-fi movies ever made, but it also set the standards for what makes a great sequel. Rather than retread what worked in the original on a grander scale, it actually dares to explore the characters further, culminating in one of the greatest endings in movie history. It's just not my favourite of the saga, because that would be... People always label this as the black sheep of the original trilogy, and for the life of me, I've never really understood why. I love all three, but the reason I think Return of the Jedi tops them all is because of the emotion behind it. The confrontation between Luke and Vader was great in Empire, but in this one it means so much more because he knows he is his father and everything is on the line. On top of that, the action is great, it looks spectacular, and it wraps up the trilogy perfectly. I said it wraps up the trilogy perfectly! Definitely my favourite of the classic horror films. The set design and music create a really creepy gothic atmosphere, but it's the lead performance that makes it all come together. Bela Lugosi brings forth one of the most iconic performances in history, and forever set the standards for horror movies and future adaptations of the character in the years that followed. Some of you might remember that I previously said the Burton film was superior, and although I still think that one did certain aspects better, this is definitely the stronger overall film of the two. More interesting dialogue, stronger action scenes, a more developed supporting cast, and Heath Ledger stealing the fucking show. It's still not my favourite Batman movie, and certain aspects of the third act don't really add up for me, but this was the film that finally got people to realise that comic book movies could be more than just disposable entertainment. For that alone, it earned its place in the book. I don't care what anyone says, this is Tarantino's masterpiece. As explained, I dig movies that are all about the less you see, and this is one of those, being one of the best heist movies ever despite never showing the heist taking place. It really shows that you can still make a great movie regardless of the limitations you might have. For that alone, it's a huge inspiration for anyone who aspires to be a filmmaker. On top of that, the dialogue is fire. The format of switching back and forth between the past and present is super innovative for its time, and the chemistry between the cast leads to some of the funniest interactions you'll see in any film ever. Speaking of Tarantino, we have another film with a crazy bastard's name on it. A controversial one for fairly obvious reasons, and I can see why it wouldn't be everyone's cup of tea, but I personally love it. Honestly, the fact that it dared to be so violent and disturbing is part of what makes it so unique. It doesn't try to baby its audience or talk down to them. It just shows you the insane and fucked up lengths people will go to in order to achieve fame. My, how things change. Arguably the best trilogy of all time, and it revitalised the fantasy genre at a time when it was desperately needed through non-stop adventure, countless memorable lines, fun characters, and exceptionally shot battle scenes. Even just the fact that Peter Jackson was allowed to film 3 big budget movies back to back had never been done before. That alone earned its place in movie history. All 3 films are an absolute blast, for no reason. Probably the film that kicked off the slasher genre, and Hitchcock really showcases his talent as the king of suspense here. Anthony Perkins gives an amazing performance as Norman Bates, and despite barely seeing anything, the movie is filled with so much horror it's unreal, leaving everyone terrified to shower again. You'd be hard pressed to find anyone who can watch Monty Python without hurting from laughing by the end of it. Almost every scene has a dozen laughs and a dozen lines you'll forever be quoting. They use the low budget to their advantage, and it's a real inspiration to anyone who's interested in filmmaking or comedy. You see what I did there? It's number 12 and it's 12 out. Oh, I'm a genius. But in all seriousness, younger me would have been genuinely shocked that this movie ended up being this high on the list. Much like The Social Network, it sounds like such a boring premise. It's just a bunch of suits chatting in a room, but it uses this one location setting to its full advantage. It's an intense and thrilling courtroom drama despite never taking the audience out of that small confined room, and it set the standard for similar films to come. On paper, this sounds like a ridiculous plot. But what more would you expect? It's Charlie Kaufman and it's amazing. It's such a silly premise, but the film balances comedy and drama so well it works. Cusack is amazing and the supporting cast are a whole lot of fun to watch as well. Sue me, it's great. One of the funniest films ever made. The balls Mel Brooks had to have released this in 1974 is amazing. The ending is a bit rushed and shitty, but there's so many hilarious moments you can't help but have a blast, despite the taboo subject matter. This is a lot of fun, despite the war, and murder, and ending. The story of a girl escaping her torment with a world of fantasy, depending how you interpret it. One of the best foreign-speaking films I have ever seen. But not the best, because... Such a great story of a troubled man learning the error of his ways and protecting a small child. A lot of people sadly haven't heard of this one, but it's well worth the effort to seek it out. One of the most severely underrated films of all time. Way better than Halloween. The serial killer in this one has speech to improve his antagonistic nature, and he has some of the most iconic and gruesome murders in history. They are fucked up but terrifying, so you really root for the teenagers to survive and beat him, unlike most slasher films where you're just begging for them to be picked off one by one. And it has the added fear factor of desperately trying to stay awake. I had no idea I would love this one as much as I did. It's such a weird subject matter, but I love the dark humour, bringing light to suicide attempts, but then instantly shifting to emotion behind it. It hits you right in the gut and does the impossible by making you care for this warped love story. One of the greatest final scenes of all time and one of the best antagonists ever put to screen. The motivation this film gives you is unreal. If you don't feel like achieving your dreams after this movie ends, well, you may as well quit, you're a failure. To this day, the greatest CGI I have ever seen. How have they not done better than this in 30 fucking years? Combining animatronics with CGI gives us some of the best practical effects in history and some of the greatest suspense. You'd think using dinosaur DNA from mosquitoes trapped in tree sap would be a little silly, but it's not. Shut up. The single funniest movie I have ever seen. While Holy Grail's overall joke ran dry in my opinion, Life of Brian I feel like had more than enough material for its entire runtime. It's hilarious and you never get a chance to breathe. The final scene is a bunch of people singing while they're being crucified. It's hilarious. I mean nothing. A movie with terrible practical effects, but everything else is so top to bottom great, you really don't give a shit. The characters and story are so memorable, the script is so on point, and the tension so palpable you don't even need a convincing looking shark to sell it anyway. We barely see the thing, and it's still terrifying. My favourite film from my favourite filmmaker. What, Indiana Jones 5? Some of the best cinematography ever put to film with one of the most badass actors in history. The third act is iconic and forever remembered, and rightfully so. It's a tremendously paced picture with so many iconic characters, and in my opinion, the greatest movie I have reviewed from this book thus far. And there you have it, guys, and I will see you in another 100 movies time.